Hi everyone, my name is Frederick and I'm from Reasonable Faith, Singapore. I majored in philosophy, graduating top of my batch, and published papers in academic journals. And now I'm doing a master's in philosophy at NTU, specializing in philosophy of religion. Now many people when they hear this, they say, wait, aren't you supposed to be a smart guy? And philosophy, how can you still be a Christian? Well, I was a skeptic once and I had like a million questions. But having investigated Christianity, I can tell you that we have good reasons and good evidences that Christianity is true. So today, we're going to run through some very short and simplified answers to some questions that you may have regarding Christianity. Well, one question I always get is from atheists. Why do you believe God exists? Well, I can tell you that there are many different arguments, lines of evidences out there that you can explore. But today, let me share with you two quick arguments. Argument 1 is the Kalam Cosmological argument. And argument 2 is the moral argument. The Kalam Cosmological argument was developed in the 12th century by a Muslim theologian. And since then, contemporary scholars have taken it and updated it using contemporary science, mathematics, and philosophy. It goes like this. Premise 1. Anything that begins to exist has a cause. Idea is very simple. Things cannot just pop into existence out of nothing like magic. Here's an example that I like to use for students. If you bring your homework home with all the questions, but no one does your homework for you, can the answers suddenly appear on the paper? Obviously not. If something suddenly appears on the paper, we will ask, where did it come from? Did your parents write it? Was it written in invisible ink? Or what? So that's a good reason to believe premise 1. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. This idea is supported by most of contemporary science. So for example, we have the second law of thermodynamics. We have different cosmological models like the standard Big Bang theory, and we have different theorems like the BGV theorem. All these are very chim, but they all point towards the idea that the universe is finitely old. It began to exist. Besides contemporary science, we also have philosophical arguments arguing that time cannot be infinite. And so the universe must have begun to exist at some point of time. Now, if we accept both premise 1 and premise 2 because of science and philosophy, then we're led to the conclusion that the universe must have a cause. Something or someone created the universe. And whoever did this must exist outside of the universe. This means that since the universe contains all time, space, and matter, the creator of the universe must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, and also must have other properties like being very powerful to create the whole universe. And so there you have it, the very first argument for God. Now wait a second, one might object. Who created God? Well, this objection can be replied quite simply. Remember, premise 1 doesn't say that everything has a cause, because that would include God. Instead, premise 1 says that anything that begins to exist must have a cause. In the case of God, since He is timeless, He is without beginning, He does not need a cause. And this is why some atheists are now trying to show the universe never began to exist in order to escape having a cause. So that's argument 1. And if you're interested, you can check out more resources in the description below. The second argument we have for God is the moral argument. It goes like this. Premise 1. Objective moral laws exist. Now we have many examples of moral laws. We should not have child abuse, racism, rape. And all these are objective. This means it's not a matter of personal taste and preference. Like, I don't like to rape, but the rapist loves to rape. And it's also not a matter of just whatever society says. Like our society doesn't endorse racism, but another society does. Instead, we would think, no, racism is always wrong for all people, all time, all places. It is in this sense objective. Now you might, however, object, wait, don't different societies disagree? They have many differences and we even change our views over time. Doesn't that make morality subjective? Well, the answer is no. A lot of these differences actually just have to do with the non-moral differences. But more importantly, differences, changing our minds, all these do not make the matter subjective. We know in math, there are disagreements. You go to any mathematics class, there's the question, we disagree on what the answer is. That doesn't make it subjective. We know in science, there are disagreements. They even change their views over time. That does not make science subjective either. And so disagreements, changing our minds, all this do not make morality subjective. Premise 2. If objective moral laws exist, then there must be a moral law giver. The moral law is a requirement, it's an obligation that we are supposed to follow. And so someone must be requiring of us, someone must be laying down this law for us. And therefore we end up at the conclusion that a moral law giver must exist. And this moral law giver, whoever it is, it must have authority over all people across all time, all places. And we also know the nature of the moral lawgiver through the moral law. It must be good and loving. So there we have it, our second argument for God. And if you're interested, you can check out more resources in the description below. Let's pause and reflect. Question 1. Which parts of these two arguments do you agree or disagree with? Question 2. What steps would you like to take to explore these two arguments further? Alright, you might say, perhaps God exists, but why Christianity? Why not just believe God exists out there, but no religion has found God yet? Well, I think the best line of evidence comes from historical data regarding Jesus' resurrection. Now, historians have studied this historical figure, this Jesus, who lived 2,000 years ago in Israel. And we have many different sources for this. Of course, we have the Christian sources, but we also have non-Christian sources, such as Greek sources, Roman sources, Jewish sources, and more. Historians, of course, don't accept everything that is said, especially when it comes to the Christian sources. They really scrutinize it. But what they do is they take the sources, they apply the historical method to it, and they filter through. And from there, they can establish different historical facts. Now, this leads many different scholars who have studied this issue to agree on quite a number of facts. And this includes both Christians and non-Christian scholars. Now, there are three I like to highlight. Fact 1. Jesus was crucified. He died on the cross, and this was a public death, and he was killed by Romans who are experts in killing. Fact number 2. The tomb that Jesus was buried in was found empty. The body was missing. Very strange indeed. Fact number 3. A lot of people claim to have seen Jesus after his death. And this did not just happen in individual settings, this happened in group settings, meaning it cannot be a hallucination. And in fact, it wasn't just believers who believed that they saw, it was skeptics and even an enemy of Christianity who later believed that he saw Jesus. And this transforms their lives radically. Now, you can check out more on the historical data in the description below. But now, let's ask what best explains the facts. Well, I think what best explains all these facts and more is that God actually raised Jesus up from the dead. Why? It's in order to vindicate the claims that Jesus made while he was alive. In other words, it was to put a stamp of approval on what Jesus taught. And Jesus taught that he is the Messiah. And so with that, we have good reasons to believe Christianity is true based on this historical argument. Now you might object, wait a second, I read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and there seems to be many contradictions. What do you say to that? Well, first off, you must note the historical case for the resurrection doesn't depend on these parts. As I said, historians take the whole source, but they filter it through the historical method, and then they come up with the historical facts. So you don't need to worry that contradictions affect the historical case. But still, you might worry about the contradictions because it's supposed to be God's word. So let me say two things about this. First, many of the differences are not genuine differences, they're just apparent. So they can be harmonized. So for example, you can check out this YouTuber called Inspiring Philosophy, and he has a whole list of so-called differences and he shows you how to harmonize it. But let me give you one quick example. For example, in one gospel, it talks about the Passover being on a Thursday. In another gospel, it says that the very same Passover happened on a Friday. Which is right, Thursday or Friday? Friday we seem to have a contradiction. Well, New Testament scholars study this issue and they realize in the first century there are competing calendars. The day starts at different timings. And so they say this gospel is using this calendar and the other gospel is using another calendar. And that's why they're reporting Thursday and Friday. So there is no real contradiction after all. But the second point, perhaps there are genuine contradictions and differences in the Gospels. But that is not necessarily a problem because of literary devices. Now, Michael Licona has argued in his wonderful book, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? And he says the Bible is very similar to first century Greco-Roman biographies. And those biographies, they use certain literary devices that allows them to alter minor details in order to bring across certain points or purposes. Here's one quick example. In the Gospel of Mark, we have the story of Jesus. He goes up to the fig tree, he curses it, and then he and the disciples go away, and the next morning, when they all come back, the fig tree is withered. That seems to say it took a while to happen. But in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus goes up to the fig tree, he curses it, and it withers. It seems to be immediate there and then. Which is it? A long period of time? Or did it happen there and then? Michael Licona argues that, well, it took a long period of time, but Matthew tells the story shorter. He uses a technique called compression, where you don't need to give the full details of all the time, but you can compress the time to tell the shorter story. And this is not considered an error, simply because we have to read those documents as first century documents, and we shouldn't be reading these documents as 21st century historical reports. So these contradictions are not a problem for the Bible being God's word. Now, of course, some historians have tried to come up with competing explanations for these historical facts, but they're all riddled with many different problems. And if you're interested, you can check out the video we have in the description below. Let's pause and reflect. Question 1. Why do you think certain historians accept these historical facts, but not the resurrection explanation? Question 2. Have you come across passages that seem to contradict? Do you think that they can be harmonized? Alright, you might have heard all these arguments, but you might be still wondering, how about science? This is one of the big objections. Well, science tells us that the Earth, the universe, is very old. And it also often tells us about evolution. Doesn't that contradict Christianity? Well, some scholars have tried to debate the science. Especially in the case of macroevolution, you even have non-religious scientists who debate the science. Instead, I think a better way is to look at the theology. Does all of this really contradict the Genesis account? Well, since a very long time ago, theologians have already offered many different interpretations of Genesis. And a lot of these are compatible with contemporary science. Now, think about the 6 days of creation. That seems to say that the earth is very young. What do we do with that? Well, Hebrew scholars and Old Testament scholars have noted the word day in Genesis is yom in Hebrew. And yom doesn't necessarily mean a 24-hour period of time. Instead, it can mean an unspecified period of time. It can be much longer, it can be much shorter. Now, if this is correct, then the 6 so-called days can be 6 long periods of time, and this can allow the universe and the earth to be very old. But what if the word yom is discovered to be 6 24-hour time periods? Well, that is still not so problematic. Why? It's because theologians note, yes, Genesis is trying to cover historical events, but it uses poetic and figurative language in order to talk about these events. And so we should not press it for literal precision. Now, how about evolution? Well, theologians note that God can use processes to do things. And so God can use the process of evolution even in creation itself. And this doesn't just work with figurative interpretations of Genesis. Andrew Locke has argued that even if you take a literal reading of Genesis, it is fully compatible with evolution. And other scholars have done likewise. For example, if we look into Genesis 1:11, it doesn't say that God snapped his fingers and immediately plants appeared. Instead, God commands the earth to bring forth plants and to reproduce. And the Hebrew words all being used there describe some sort of process. And so theologians argue that this is perfectly compatible with evolution. Let's pause and reflect. Question 1. In the past, how have you responded to friends who say that science and Christianity are in conflict? Question 2. What are some things you would do or say differently after today? Alright, you still might have more questions, and everything I said has been really simplified for this short video. Well, do check out more Christian apologetics resources in the links I've provided. And you can also connect with us at RZIM Faith Singapore. We have a website and a Facebook group as well for you to connect with us. So see you there.